So you've had a cognitive scientist, and you've had a political scientist, and now you get a lawyer. I'm a practicing lawyer as well. It's my job is to litigate cases in U.S. courts that raise freedom of expression issues as they arise in the use of digital technologies. And so much of what I'm going to talk about is really informed by my practical experience, try to tackle some of these very difficult issues. And I think building off a lot of what has been spoken about already, I do intend this to be a bit of a provocation, and so I welcome the questions and challenges. I always feel like this is an area where I think that all of us who work on it feel like we're on shaky ground and in uncertain positions. So just in terms of background, when I first started working on freedom of expression issues full-time about 25 years ago, I was focused on helping avant-garde artists and arts organizations with their ability to stage exhibitions or create art that was, when that ability was challenged. And so we would advocate on their behalf. We'd provide legal and educational materials and generally tried to help them as much as we could. And these challenges, they took many forms. Members of the community might demand that a painting or a photograph be removed from an exhibition, literally taken off of a wall, or that performance be canceled, or that certain works comes with warnings affixed to them, like, this art might not be appropriate for children. These challenges could come from the state, and certainly when the creation or the exhibition of the work was maybe supported by public funds, or the exhibition space was controlled by the government, such as a public gallery or theater. In that role, I was really less concerned with who was calling for the censorship than the fact that it was happening at all. I didn't make a hard distinction between state and private censors. Now, while under US law, that distinction is important, I can come back to that point later, although I certainly don't really intend or really want to talk about US law exclusively here. I wasn't at that job serving as the artist lawyers. I was, or the organization's lawyers, I was really there for them as a resource. Now, for most of the artists and the galleries and exhibitors in that, for most of the artists, the galleries and the exhibitors were what we'd call intermediaries and essential intermediaries. That is, these few artists could effectively show or perform their works without going through a gallery or a theater or an exhibition space to reach their larger audiences. Some artists might have their own spaces or spaces to exhibit or perform their works, but many did not, probably most did not. And so they relied on these intermediaries to draw attention to their works. The galleries might advertise for them, or the galleries might actually have their own followings. People would trust the gallery's decision-making and rely on them that whoever they would present would be something that someone would either want to see or at least be moved by it in some way. Now, when I was doing this work way back in 1997, the internet as a tool of mass media was still relatively new. And there was a widely held perception that the internet allowed artists and many others to bypass these traditional intermediaries. In English, we tended to call them gatekeepers at that time. And to reach their audiences directly, there was great promise in this. And it was true to an extent, but the larger truth, which I think we all knew at the time, was that we were just trading gatekeepers, that there were going to be new gatekeepers. And so rather than galleries or publishers or theater owners, there were going to be various online intermediaries that people use to communicate with each other. And just with most artists, we're not able to communicate with their public effectively without intermediaries. The same thing is certainly true online. Few of us had then or have now the technical expertise to code even simple HTML that will allow us to set up a web page without the assistance of an intermediary. Few of us had the technical infrastructure required. Maybe none of us had the technical infrastructure required. We relied on ISPs to connect us to the internet, web hosts to host the message boards that maybe we would control or use, external servers to store and transmit everything, domain name registrars to give us our web addresses, and on and on and on. So what we got again was, of course, there was a lot written about sort of these new gatekeepers, and we still talk quite a bit about these new gatekeepers. So, flash forward to the present, and we, and regulators around the world are now well aware of these many online gatekeepers, although there's many that I think are actually quite invisible to us as well. These now prominently include the large globally adopted social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and TikTok, search engines such as Google, messaging services such as WhatsApp and Telegram, and it also includes some new gatekeepers, maybe ones we don't think about as much. I mentioned things like web hosting services and domain name registrars, but there's also some services that have arisen more recently. Many of these have come into existence based on internet security concerns, such as certificate authorities, DDoS protection services, content delivery networks as well. These are all sort of essential tools. I have a slide about this, so I don't know will help at all, but if you can turn it to the next one. And so you can see there's sort of a stack of services anybody trying to communicate, get their speech to their audience will go through. So when we think about freedom of expression online, each of these intermediaries becomes a point of vulnerability. Somebody who wants to challenge your freedom of expression has many places with which they could try to challenge this. So each is a potentially weak link in your chain of communication between the speaker and their audience. It is these points where an intermediary may decide to break the chain of communication. They may refuse to transmit a particular communication, or will this work if I use this? Okay, look at that. How do you like that? They may refuse to serve a particular speaker. These decisions may be purely their own, or they may be the result of external pressure. That external pressure can come, it may be some like the external pressures at the galleries and theaters I worked with previously. It could come from the public, it could come from the governments. So we can see, we could run through these. Let's see if I do this in the right direction. I'm really bad with slides. This is why I shouldn't use them at all, right? Anyway, if you just run through the next several, did I do that or someone in the back do that? Anyway, any place along this series, there could be a break in the chain of communication that is effectively not allowing your speech go to the intended recipients. Now, these weak links are especially dangerous when they become choke points. And that's where a lot of expression passes through a relatively narrow channel of intermediaries. Now, I think there's two main reasons why an intermediary may become a choke point. One is that there's simply too few of them. There are few intermediaries, maybe because of market dominance or just because of some technological proprietary innovation. And so I think payment processors, which are very faint down in the bottom there, if you're trying to do online commerce, there are actually very few choices of payment processors. And if so, someone like Visa decided they did not want to service you, that would actually that would have significant ability on the ability to complete that transaction. There's a second reason, though, why we have choke points, and that's when there are many choices of intermediaries, but some of them are so widely adopted globally that their decisions have outside influence. They too can cut off a significant amount of global expression, even though maybe they don't dominate the market in the traditional way that economists and even lawyers think about in terms of market dominance. And social media companies are actually a good example of this. There are many, many, many social media platforms, but there are some that are so widely adopted that their decisions have such outside influence. So when Twitter decides to cancel someone's account, we all sort of hear about that, and even though Twitter's not the only service that does what it does. So I'm going to focus here in my talk really talking more about these social media checkpoints and the particular freedom of expression issues associated with them. And specifically, I want to really focus on one particularly troubling conundrum that I really hope is sort of steps off from what the previous speakers have talked about. And that's really the need to actually acknowledge the freedom of expression interests of these social media companies to edit and curate their sites, even though when in doing so, they may silence individual users. And let me explain why I believe it's important to actually, in many situations, have to become a champion for these sites that we think are maybe threats to our democracy. That's the provocative part, by the way. So every social media company, from the very large ones to the very small ones, they edit and curate the user speech that gets published through their services. And this may take the form of removing user expression or suspending users' account, but there are many other editorial methods that are widely employed: amplification, de-amplification, labeling, fixing warnings or comments, on and on and on. Some of these things that Henrik just talked about as well. Now, every service has some editorial rules. Some call them community standards or content policies. And some are company generated. Others are devised by the users themselves. There's a model called community moderation, where the members of the community actually make up and enforce their own rules. This process is broadly known as content moderation. That's the, I think, very bulky and inappropriate term that we globally settled on, and it's a fraught process. Content moderation at scale is impossible to do perfectly, nearly impossible to do well. There are simply too many posts, the rules have few bright lines, there's too much subjectivity, and as a result, there are millions of impossible decisions that have to get made every day. And a lot of these decisions seem plainly wrong, or at least many people disagree with them. I think practically everyone has a story where something they wanted to publish, where they were not able to publish, or something they wanted to read, they were not able to get access to, had been removed or made difficult to find. There are a ton of problems with content moderation, many of which I think have already been discussed, and many of them have serious human rights and freedom of expression implications. Again, the rules are unclear and ad hoc, they're constantly shifting. The decision-making process is opaque, inconsistent, lacking in basic features of due process. Some of the decision-making, maybe the vast majority of it, is likely automated, using automated systems which there's little accountability or auditing to see if they're actually effective or accurate. These systems are subject to serious manipulation. We just heard about nudging, either purposeful manipulation by the company or manipulation by external factors as well. This can be the sort of external manipulation, can be, for example, like flooding a complaint system, a coordinated effort to flood a complaint system to target complaints at a single post to get a company to take it down, or to silence a speaker. I don't think I need to repeat the many of the problems we have now with sort of large social media companies controlling so much dialect. I think we've heard it, whether it's the polarization, filter bubbles, bullshit, confirmation bias amplified times 1,000. And I've spent a good chunk of my last, I have 2 years in my notes, I actually think I have 4, documenting these deficiencies and really urging the companies to improve them and to really do so quickly. My organization and myself were among the civil liberties organizations that authored the second version of the Santa Clara Principles. I think I have a slide on that, if I could advance a few more. It's towards the end there, which is we got to do a global consultation to really talk to people all around the world about their experiences with content moderation. And what the principles are, a human rights framing for content moderations. They encourage companies to increase transparency, due process, and accountability, and provide some guideposts for doing so. Okay, but here's the conundrum. I've spent another good chunk of the last several years advocating that the same companies which do a poor job and do so in a way that I think threatens human rights, that they actually have their own legal rights under US law to edit and curate their sites and cannot be compelled legally to publish any user speech. As much as we may, and I do dislike how content moderation is conducted by the large social media platforms, I also believe it's important to protect their right to do it. And even if they're doing it badly, and even if they're doing it at the expense of some users' ability to speak. I don't really want to talk about why this is the correct, I think it's the correct rule under US law, though if people really want to ask about that or talk about it over coffee, I'm happy to do that. But I do want to explain why I think it's the best result for freedom of expression principles, and also why I think it ultimately serves internet users best. And this gets back, to me, the main reason going back to the idea of choke points is that social media sites are choke points for global communications. And as such, they are very attractive targets for states, both democratic and non-democratic states who want to control expression. And the pressure on a single social media choke point can have serious effects on our public dialogue. And this includes states pressuring the services both to remove user expression, as well as states forcing sites to publish user expression. And it's really the latter example, the state really compelling the publication of user expression, where I think the free expression conundrum resides. Legally requiring social media services to publish particular posts give government the ability to tilt public dialogue to their favored viewpoints, drown out dissent, and ensure that otherwise, and provide a platform maybe for discredited voices that the government favors. What might appear to be a state effort to combat censorship is rather a state effort to control ideas. This is something we live with a lot right now in the US. We have 2 states, Texas and Florida. They each passed laws that in some way required large social media companies to publish user posts, to require them not just to publish them, but to publish them unimpededly, without moderating them in some way, without making any type of amplification decisions about them at all. Each is a response to a perception, and what I personally believe is a misperception, that the expression of US conservatives, the way we use the term conservatives in the US, is disproportionately moderated in a negative fashion. So the Florida law prevents social media companies from performing any content moderation at all on posts from candidates for political office, as well as poorly defined journalistic enterprises. These provisions were in response to instances in which some conservative candidates for office and news sites were blocked or suspended or deprioritized, mostly for violating social media sites' misinformation standards. And most of that was really for what the sites considered to be misinformation about COVID. The Texas law is a bit different. It prevents very large social media companies from treating some viewpoints differently than others, so that a social media company under that law is forbidden from considering the viewpoint expressed in the post. It's actually not even in the post. It's the viewpoint of the speaker, whether expressed in the post or anywhere else, from using that in making any type of moderation decisions. That's whether to amplify or de-amplify or block or allow at all. Now, the legality of these laws is currently before the courts. There's actually been a split in the courts. The Florida law was declared unconstitutional. The Texas law was actually just a few days ago, after I had written my remarks, was upheld. So it seems very likely that the US Supreme Court will sort of resolve how this comes out under US law. So I think there are many practical reasons to oppose these laws. They will open social media sites up to an avalanche of private lawsuits. That's one of them. I think, to me, it's the prospect of selective prosecutorial power that is this really significant threat to freedom of expression, and a real serious usurpation of power by the states. And I do really see this as inseparable from perhaps the more obvious threat to freedom of expression, which is the state-coerced removal of legal but undesirable user speech. I mean, the right to edit or curate includes controlling both what you publish and what you do not. So the art curators I worked with previously did not decide just what to exhibit, they decided what not to exhibit. And among when they decide what to exhibit, they decided how to exhibit it, which works to feature and emphasize and which works to include, but maybe not draw special attention to. So social media companies do the same. It's not just removing user expression, it's deciding what to highlight, where to place on their sites, how frequently to highlight it or suggest it to readers. These are similar decisions, again, to what newspaper editors make when they decide whether to publish wire service stories or letters to the editor, when they decide where within their print online publication to include articles and advertisements. And so in order to preserve a social media service's right to publish, we must preserve the right to publish in the manner they decide or not at all. Now, a colleague of mine who I respect deeply, who is a fervent free expression advocate, called me out on this, saying, I just care more about the free speech rights of people than the free speech rights of companies. And asked me if I were valuing the free speech, the speech of corporations over the speech of individuals. It's a fair question. I answered no, but it's one that I very much took to heart. I don't think I am. At these choke points, we all, for better or worse, relying on these services to be our bulwarks against government manipulation. I don't think we would have picked these heroes if we had a choice, but I think we're in the position where we are relying on them to do so, and we need to support their right to be able to do so free from governmental interference. I also think that in terms of the way most people use the internet, it's the best policy as well. Although social media users really don't want their own posts moderated negatively, they generally do want social media companies to moderate and to address certain legal speech. Personal harassment is one example, encounter quite a bit, those who are subject to personal harassment may want to use a service that will take action against that, and may choose not to use a service that is not responsive to it as well. Disinformation is an especially difficult problem. Social media sites have been subject to great pressure, both from states and the public, to deprioritize or remove false information, especially when it pertains to public health or elections, or to employ fact-checking. These are all things that, at least acknowledging their right to edit and curate, allow them to do. Another issue that's come up very recently, companies are currently spending a lot of time addressing how they deal with the live streaming of terrorist and other violent attacks. Speech which is perfectly legal, which they, in most places, could not be legally compelled to remove, but which many of them want to do so because that's not what they want their sites being used for. And of course, each of these have their own problems. These are all very difficult. Misinformation is extremely difficult. What some consider to be a sincerely held belief, to some is a grave falsity. Truth can be elusive, or as we've seen in the case of public health information, may continuously evolving. The traditional liberal freedom of expression strategy for false information is to combat it with better information rather than hiding it or silencing it. Harassment can be too contextual and seems far different when you're aiming it at a state official than a private person. And these are, of course, areas that states are quite active in as centers as well, pressuring social media companies to remove posts or block users or otherwise exploit content moderation intended to serve user interests. The Santa Clara principles, which I mentioned earlier, identify state interference in content moderation as a serious problem and calls for states to forego ferment, to be transparent in their interactions with social media companies. The principles, what they say is that state actors must not exploit or manipulate companies' content moderation systems to censor dissenters, political opponents, social movements, or any person. And the companies are directed to clearly report to users when there's any state involvement in the enforcement of the company's rules and policies, including both requests regarding their own accounts or posts or more systemic involvement and working relationships with governments. So in no case should the social media company abandon its own editorial policies and adopt those of the state. That was my provocation. So before I conclude, I want to say a few words about the idea of neutrality. This is the idea that sites should publish all legal speech and treat all legal speech the same. I actually personally prefer this as a user. I am on my social media things. I have them set to chronological feeds. I don't really like the curated and favorited hot topics or things like that. But I actually think it's an unrealized and unfeasible ideal. Many sites are not neutral by design. They are specialized. They may be organized by subject matter or special interests. Strava, for example, is a social media site for runners. Roblox, social media sites really originally for children gaming, and now more for gaming more generally. Pinterest for creative pursuits. So these things were never designed to be neutral. The people who use them don't expect to really want them to be neutral. Even sites that sort of cast themselves as general purpose sites really have never been neutral. There's sites like TikTok where the feature of it is actually its suggestion algorithm. That's why people use TikTok, is because it suggests to them content that it thinks they'll like, even if they don't have to follow somebody to get that. And I think really importantly, historically, sites have always moderated some expression. There was never really a golden period of neutrality in time when there was no moderation. Much legal sexual expression was always denied a place among these sort of highly adopted sites, and still is. I think if you would ask some of the research I've seen more recently, if you look at sort of who's most blocked and censored on social media, sex worker advocates are at the top of the list. In the US, Palestinian rights advocates are a close second. But the idea that sexual expression has never really had a welcome home on many of these sites. Now, I hear generally, and I think some of our speakers later will talk about this, and I agree with those who correctly point out that we live in dangerous times for freedom of expression. There's currently a social climate in which many are too quick to call for censorship rather than engaging in discussion or otherwise challenging ideas with which they disagree. And we see social media companies doing the same thing, seemingly defaulting to taking down posts when they receive complaints about them, or prematurely cutting off conversations. As complaint systems become more well-known, they're being manipulated. They get flooded with complaints, and this is really also, and gone with the volume, is really sort of forcing companies to move in the direction of more automated, AI-driven moderation systems. And it's a dangerous time to really advocate for these companies' right to censor. But I do think that we must do it, at least in the courtroom, lest states seize the opportunity to embed themselves as a regulatory matter in these procedures and in these processes. And I do think this is difficult. I think we can see some efforts that really look like trying to respond to a threat to democracy. For example, maybe a social media site that is highlighting or emphasizing electoral misinformation, wanting to try and respond to that. But again, I think it's a dangerous place for states to exercise power. Now, with respect to other intermediaries on this stack, we may reach far different conclusions. Or perhaps we might say that, and I'm happy if we want to talk about this during the discussion period, otherwise, that maybe your certificate authority should be completely neutral. I'm far less comfortable advocating for editorial rights of like domain name registrars or DDoS protection services than I am for social media companies. And I actually have affirmatively, in the US, supported legal requirements that impose neutrality obligations on ISPs. So I think we might have a different conversation at different choke points along the way. But what do we do then if we need to actually respect and acknowledge the rights of these companies to moderate, to curate this information, and even if we perceive it as having non-democratic or threats to liberty within it? I do think we have an obligation to hold their feet to the fire, to draw attention to their bad decisions, assist those who've been harmed by them, urge them to adopt and implement better procedures. That's the Santa Clara principles are an effort to do that. And I understand that these remedies may seem insufficient. They tend to place a really heavy and unfunded burden on civil society, which is something I feel strongly about. And the companies really seem frequently to ignore us, and it's just a lot of work. But ultimately, I believe that exercising our freedom of expression in this matter is the better alternative to granting states the extraordinary power to control and manipulate these digital choke points. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you very much, David. Now I would like to invite Henrik back to this stage for the Q&A session. And before we start, there was actually a very good remark that I got. If you want to ask a question, but you're a Czech speaker and you don't feel comfortable asking a question in English, feel free to ask it in Czech, and I'll do my best to translate it. So, and I'll pass the microphone.
Tak já jsem ten případ, který si netroufne ve své špatné angličtině to vyslovit, tak poprosím, jestli Adame to přeložíš.
Okay.
Já si myslím, že otázka, jestli mají mít právo platformy moderovat, není úplně přesná nebo není úplná a zkusím ji doplnit ze dvou hledisek.
Question whether the platforms have the right to moderate is not exactly precise, and he would like to add to it and ask for your thoughts.
První aspekt je, že když se někdo rozhodne podnikat takovým způsobem, že vytvoří veřejný prostor, tak se tím vlastně sám vzdal určitých svých, jako řekl bych, vlastnických práv a musí respektovat něco, co patří k veřejnému prostoru.
So the claim is that if somebody decides to create a business, that essentially its purpose is in creating a public sphere, then that has the implication that he has to forego some of the rights that he might have as a private business in other areas. And is there another?
A druhý doplním na základě srovnání v České listině článku 17 a 18. Článek 18 se týká shromažďovacího práva a ještě možná to...
Okay, and the second question is based on Czech law, namely on the list of fundamental human rights that we have. One is the right to gather.
He doesn't have to do it.
Yeah?
Demonstrovat.
Okay, the right of assembly. Right?
A tento článek se realizuje z hlediska státní moci, že když jsou dvě demonstrace, tak tam nastoupí policejní kordony a sledují v zásadě dvě věci. Když někdo zvedne transparent, promiňte mi to takhle přeženu, Židi do plynu, tak po něm skočí a sejmou ho. A druhý aspekt, že když jedni vytlačují, přetlačují, druhé narušují, tak zasáhnou. A takhle stát prosazuje základní lidské právo.
Okay, so the analogy is with the right to assemble, and
We'll finish now.
and the idea is that imagine in a completely different context, you've got two protests on the street, and you've got the police whose job it is to protect the fundamental rights of both of those groups and to jump in. And I think the analogy is trying to draw on your provocative idea as to an extent should the government interfere to protect the fundamental right, give them the social platforms are effectively public spheres.
A článek 17 říká, cenzura je nepřípustná.
And also that one of the other articles of the fundamental...
I get it from here now. So.
Super. A státní moc vůbec nezasahuje, když třeba platforma provede cenzurní zásah zcela nepřijatelný. A ještě nutno pro vás, kteří jste z anglosaského právního prostředí, říci, že Česká listina je jakoby závazkem státu prosazovat ta práva, zatímco třeba první dodatek americké ústavy pouze říká, kongres nesmí přijmout zákon, který omezí, tak my to máme tak, že vlastně smysl listiny a ústavy je smlouva mezi občany a státem, že on to bude hájit a prosazovat. A tady z toho plyne tedy podle našeho názoru, našeho říkám, protože je to výstup nějakého našeho projektu, že role státu zde má být moderační vůči tomu moderátorovi. To znamená vnucovat mu proces a říkat, jestli ty zasáhneš proti nějakému projevu, tak musíš si to okamžitě ve stanovených lhůtách se stanovenými procesy odvolání a pod určitou kontrolou a možná i následně za porušení procesu sankcí, čili ne za otázku pravdy, nepravdy, ale za porušení procesu, tak tam by měl stát zasahovat. Čili myslím si, že ta vaše otázka, mají mít právo moderovat, je potřeba ji doplnit o tyto dva pohledy. Za prvé se vzdali tímto způsobem podnikání určitých svých, jako řekl bych, podnikatelských, soukromoprávních, majetkových práv. A za druhé role státu by vůči tomu pak měla být takováto. Děkuji moc krát a omlouvám se za to zdržování.
Does that make sense? 2 points is that social platforms as public space, the other one, government as a guarantor.
Yes. Yeah, so I really appreciate the comments. I'm happy to address them from a legal perspective, and I'm really interested in what Henrik has to say from a sort of a broader concepts of liberty. The first, the idea of that you have some obligation of controlling a public space. In the U.S., we call this a public forum law, and this is an argument that has been made. It was really the first argument that was made when there were efforts. First argument was made in courts where there were efforts to impose legal obligations to carry certain speech. Courts rejected that. I think it's correct. The sort of legal technical reason it was rejected under U.S. law was that with government control of a public forum is just a much different thing than private control of a public space, and that there are many spaces where people interact that are privately controlled, and we do not allow the government to go into those spaces and to then exert additional control over that. And I do think that's the correct result. I think that is granting the state an inordinate amount of power, even when it's a well-intentioned state in doing so. I think the other point you raised regarding a positive right for freedom of expression is a very compelling point. As you noted very correctly, in the U.S. we do not have a positive right for freedom of expression. It's a negative right that the government cannot interfere with. We had a Supreme Court decision, not this past term, but the one before, which really sort of talked about a positive right for freedom of expression for the very first time. That was in the context of a school where that maybe school administrators had an affirmative obligation to support and lift up students' rights. That was really the first I'd ever seen of a notion of a positive right. And there actually is a lawsuit going on in Poland right now that is brought by a colleague, civil society organization called Panopticon that's challenging Facebook's decision to remove I believe it was an abortion rights site. And so I believe that's important. I feel that I have a hard time separating the benevolence of democratic societies seeking to do good from the threat of other states seeking to do bad, which is a threat I see every day. It's a threat we're seeing right now with Iran just shutting off Instagram, but I really don't want to say that it only exists in either times of crises or in what may be considered non-democratic states. I think there may be a role for enforcing a positive right in this situation. I just see it as a very limited role, and I don't know where the boundaries of it are. I'm really interested to see whether, as this lawsuit in Poland, which is moving very, very slowly as it develops, whether it will articulate some boundaries in there that for which I would be comfortable with.
Yeah, I don't have too much to add, but I could add kind of from my perspective, the right to moderate is kind of obvious for these companies, so I support that provocative statement. But I think the government's role should be to kind of do good competitive policies and prevent certain actors and platforms from being too powerful and preventing monopolies and kind of those kind of market failure approach to these sorts of platforms rather than compelling them to be neutral or do these things. That might entail kind of restricting what sort of data they can gather and use, but it also kind of relates to different purposes related to kind of preventing certain private actors from becoming what is kind of social infrastructure. So that would be kind of my main comment, that I think they should be free to have very different ideological spheres and create them at will and moderate them at will, but that we should be wary once actors become too powerful in that sphere.
Yeah, and I agree that it's appropriate for states to pursue other remedies, whether that is pro-competition remedies or data privacy as well. I think most data privacy regulation is appropriate in this situation. So I do think there may be other regulatory approaches a state could take to address what it perceives as a problem of one company's speech decisions having outsized influence. We talk a lot about decentralization in this approach, in terms of structural decentralization, sort of decentralizing the web and having more interactive and interoperable services. And I think that answers some of the questions, but I don't think it actually addresses a lot of the problems that we see. Yeah.
Sorry, may I just edit the question? Would you just clarify your stance as to whether the platforms constitute public space? Or whether is that what the first part?
Yes. I do not think they are public space in a legally significant way.
No. Yeah, I agree. It's not a public sphere in a Habermasian way, like in that sense, but I don't think kind of legally I agree. Not necessarily, at least.
Hi. Microphone, yeah.
Oh, no, sorry.
I'm sorry, I will try to be brief. I understood that you are okay when a private corporation does the moderating, and I wanted to ask what's your position on when state does it? I have two examples from Czech Republic. One, we have illegal gambling regulation, where when some gambling site isn't allowed by the state says, I will write you on some list, and ISPs have the obligation to block you. That's one, and it's imposed by the law and by the decision to write you on the list. And the second one, more recent one, is a situation which encountered after the Russian invasion in Ukraine, when the government made recommendation to domain register to block all pro-Russian disinformation sites, and the register did it without any legal obligation, just as they said that they have in the terms of use, that you shall not impose risk on online safe space or yeah.
Yeah. So with the first, I make a distinction between legal speech and illegal speech. So if there is had been an adjudication that speech is illegal, then there's a role for there's an enforcement role for the state. I think there's that there's a lot to be worked out about how that role is implemented. This is in the Digital Services Act, the EU's Digital Services Act, and I don't like the way it's implemented there, certainly. So if I do make a distinction between legal and illegal, so most of what I'm speaking about is the decision to moderate legal content, which they have no legal obligation to remove. I think the second point you raise is to what extent can government make requests or suggestions? I certainly think in many situations that's an appropriate role for government. What I think is in many situations it's not. And I think it's hard to catalog which are the correct ones and which are not. What I do think is critical is that it's the sites that are actually making the ultimate editorial decision, and that they're neither adopting an editorial policy that was put on them by the government or even worked on cooperatively with the state, and that it's their own decision and the own implementation of their own policy. I've actually written about this fairly recently, and if you search for my name and EFF where I work, and the word jawboning is how we tend to call it in the US, you'll find my few articles I wrote about that recently.
Yeah, I agree, and I think it's interesting to distinguish between legality and not, and I think that also relates to the kind of approach to try to nudge rather than kind of make things illegal, right? Where we try to achieve government goals through kind of moderation, if you want, not really of a platform, so it's not really that classical form of moderation, but it's trying to be perceived as kind of liberal and liberty-preserving while simultaneously trying to be kind of enforcing paternalistic policies through kind of how we portray and moderate different messages and what's in different areas.
I really like a lot of what you guys were saying. The first speech, the one thing I wasn't really sure about is your ending, because you essentially re-raised a problem that was first raised in the 19th century, which is the pressure of public opinion. And it seems to me that the conformist imperative that does is a fact of life, but it's also something that the nudgers use to justify what they call libertarian paternalism. So their argument for nudging and manipulating our lives is precisely the fact that there's a conformist impulse within. So I just want your view on that. And secondly, in relation to you, I struggle with what you said towards the end. I agree with broadly the fact that you don't want to give the government the power to censor platforms. But isn't it the case that these platforms, at least in Europe, oh, sorry. Excuse me. Isn't it the case that, at least in Europe, these platforms can be considered to be a public infrastructure, not a public space, but a public infrastructure? And we recognize that water companies don't have the right to deny you water because they don't like your face. And we recognize that an electricity company or a gas company have got to serve the public pretty much equally. So therefore, there is, to me, a conundrum here, because if the reality is these are infrastructures that the whole public uses, and if we don't provide equal public access to it, that is a real problem. So the question is there a way of reconciling your understandable desire not to allow the state to step in and censor with the public's need to have an access to an infrastructure that they should really have a right to have access to?
Do you want to?
Yeah, I could begin. I agree with your point. It's a fact of life that people have opinions and that we take kind of them into account when we do whatever we do. So this kind of moral power of those around us is unavoidable. But I think what is problematic in what I see the kind of the tyranny of perceived opinion is when I say that when you actively try to shape people's impression of what public opinion is, actively do this through kind of manipulation and curation of information, I think that creates what might be construed of as human attributable interference in that sense. So that's kind of what I'm saying in that article. But yes, we can't get rid of kind of the problem that what other people think kind of affects me. I think that's kind of a given, that's a fact. But I think we should be wary of kind of those who have the power to shape those kind of perceptions. But still, to the second question, I just want to say that the public infrastructure argument is kind of exactly what I think we need to prevent in order to kind of limit sort of that power and what you were discussing.
Yeah, with respect to public infrastructure, so I think I read the DSA as largely rejecting a public infrastructure argument at the social media end. I think the choices that were made in the Digital Services Act reject that as a legal norm. But I'd say the argument is one that gets raised all the time. It's one that is raised in the U.S. certainly. I think, to me, I don't see social media as public infrastructure. I see the problem there as being one more of a lack of being one of market dominance and lack of competition, more than sort of something inherent in the structure of the web. I do think there are points on the stack when you get up into other services that look much more like infrastructure. So I think ISPs are certainly infrastructure. That's why I agree that there could be neutrality requirements on them. I think at the sort of domain name registrar level, I think that seems very infrastructural as well. There's an effort by many civil society groups right now, many of whom worked on the Santa Clara principles, to actually articulate some principles regarding sort of what they call infrastructural services that would try to sort of look at when do you impose neutrality obligations, at what level of service do you try to impose neutrality, or what things do you consider. This is an issue that comes up all the time in the US and other places. So the company Cloudflare, for example, I don't know how many people are familiar with Cloudflare. It's a content delivery network, which means that if you want to transmit content from place to another, you actually probably rely on them or one of their competitors, but it does tend to dominate the market. Another service it offers is DDoS protection. So it offers protection for a site against distributed denials of service, so purposeful attacks meant to block the transmission of data through the site. And for many, DDoS protection is really critical. They can't function without it. Cloudflare historically had a neutrality policy, and they had a whole explanation on their website about how they were never going to deny anybody service. And then they made the decision to deny somebody service. This was in the US. It was a US neo-Nazi publication called The Daily Stormer that had initiated was urging people to sort of personally attack a woman, and both physically and by bombarding her with messages and harassing her family. And for better or worse, Cloudflare terminated its services to that. And then on its webpage, it added a little star that said, we'll accept this one situation where we did that. And then they ultimately end up changing things. Then several years later, they denied services to 8chan. Or 8kun, which is a message board that purports to be unmoderated, even though they actually moderate content themselves, but is associated with lots of horrible things. They denied service to that, and they no longer actually now pretend to be neutral. They decided that as a business matter, it wasn't actually possible for them. Most recently, just a few weeks ago, there was a campaign against them to stop serving a website called Kiwi Farms, which seems to exist solely for the purpose of encouraging people to harass trans people, especially advocates for trans rights, and apparently was a very effective website for doing so. And there was a campaign against Cloudflare to have Cloudflare deny them services. Cloudflare first said no. And then 2 days later, they said they changed their mind and said, we actually, having spoken with law enforcement about this, law enforcement has forwarded us that their response is not adequate, and so we believe that we had to do this. So I just think I agree that there are some sites that are infrastructure, and I think it's very difficult to figure out where the neutrality obligation ends. But what I think the lived experience from most sites is that even ones we consider to be like the pipes of the internet aren't really actually able to function without doing something. So, for better or worse.
Yeah. You could just add what I forgot to your first question. You could use nudging to kind of get people out of conformity. And Sunstein has written the book called Conformity, right? But I think it's kind of the libertarian paternalism. I really don't buy that argument. It would be more, to me, kind of paternalistic manipulation. Instead, kind of when that agenda of playing on biases in order to get people to change behavior. And the norm nudging, for example, is one kind of particularly effective nudge. And that relies on just kind of telling someone that other people do this, right? This is what most people do, for example, because that's effective in getting people to do something. So it's a kind of really a manipulative way to just use that sort of need to conformity as well in nudging. So nudging can be both. It can be used to kind of put small seeds here and there to kind of make people aware of other opinions, but it could also be used to more forcefully force people into conformity. So I think it's kind of a dual-edged sword. And I think what I refer to as nudging is the non-explicit forms of nudging, because just giving someone information, for example, that's rational persuasion. That's not really nudging as I refer to it, but they refer to it elsewise.
All right, unfortunately, we don't have any time for more questions, so please give hands to the gentleman.